Good morning. Today is October 16th, 2024. Today we have a commentary on the writings of the Apocrypha. Okay. The historical record of the Old Testament, as presently divided, is composed of 39 separate writings. In the presentation thus far, the contents of these various writings have been integrated into one continuous narrative, arranged to the degree possible in the chronological order of their occurrence. The events span the period from creation to approximately 425 BC. Not until approximately 5 BC will any further events be recorded in any scriptural writings. These accounts will be contained in the New Testament, which is itself a collection of 27 different writings. Over the next 4 to 6 centuries, many other historical and religious documents pertaining to the Jews will be written. Therefore, it cannot be said that there are no historical records of the Jews arising out of this period. When it is said that the historical record of Scripture lies silent during this time, emphasis is being placed on the word Scripture. The so-called apocryphal or hidden writings of this period are not accepted as Scripture by all believers. Jumping several centuries ahead, the inclusion of these writings will begin with the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which will be widely used in the first century. The Apocrypha will then be adopted as part of the Latin Vulgate, edited by Jerome in about AD 400. In more modern times, all English versions of the Bible from AD 1382 down to and including the original King James Version of AD 1611 will contain the apocryphal writings. In the earlier Greek and Latin versions, the apocryphal writings are interspersed with the other Old Testament writings. In his German Bible of 1534, Luther will collect them into a unified supplement and present them at the end of the Old Testament. The Catholic English version retains the more scattered format even until now, but most Protestant versions will drop the Apocrypha altogether, beginning about AD 1629. In the view of those who reject their inclusion in scriptural canon, the apocryphal writings do not meet the test of having originated from divine inspiration. The Apocrypha are never included in the Hebrew Old Testament, and the Jews do not accept these writings as part of their approved scriptures. In fact, Hebrew manuscripts of most of the apocryphal writings are not even to be found. It is perhaps significant that several of the writings reflect notions of mysticism and demonology, apparently traceable to Persian influences during the Jewish dispersion and arguably inconsistent with either Jewish or later Christian beliefs. Despite their current lack of credibility among a large segment of believers, these disputed writings are generally moral in nature and do give insight into some of the history, customs, and religious developments of the Jews during this intertestamental period. The following 14 writings, briefly summarized at this point, comprise the so-called Apocrypha. Although most of them emerge from 300 BC to AD 100, several refer back to earlier times and assume various specific historical contexts. Okay, so this is the Apocrypha, First Esdras. The Greek name for Ezra is a historical record from the end of the exile until the completion of the temple. It is a compilation which virtually duplicates portions of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles. One additional story purports to explain Zerubbabel's leading role in the rebuilding of the temple. According to the story, Zerubbabel argued successfully against two other guards of King Darius that women in truth are stronger than kings and wine. Second Esdras is of Latin origin in the first 3 centuries AD and purports to record a series of apocalyptic visions about the future of the world. In that regard, it is similar to the apocalyptic visions of the leading prophets, particularly those of Daniel. A major portion of the writing addresses many of the hard issues confronted in the book of Job. How can God permit the suffering of his people? Why should God choose nations more wicked than Israel itself to punish Israel? Why live righteously when the wicked seem to be more prosperous? How long will it be before the righteous finally get their reward? How will the wicked be punished? And just as in Job, although some answers are provided, the basic response is that there are simply many things which man cannot yet know. The Book of Tobit is a piece of religious fiction about a pious Jew named Tobit and his son Tobias. The story itself is primarily about Tobias' journey from Nineveh to a city called Ecbatana to retrieve money which his father has deposited there. On his journey, Tobias meets and marries a distant cousin, Sarah, who has lost 7 husbands, each on the night of the wedding before the marriage was consummated. A central figure in the story introduces elements of Persian mysticism and demonism. This figure purports to be an archangel by the name of Raphael, who is disguised as Tobias's guide. Apart from the storyline, the moral message is a promotion of unselfishness and charity, particularly as seen in the life of Tobit and in the principles which he instills on his son. The Book of Judith is another piece of religious fiction about a beautiful Jewish woman named Judith who saves her city, and indeed the entire nation of Israel, by deceiving an Assyrian general and cutting off his head. The general, whose name is Holofernes, is supposedly under the command of Nebuchadnezzar, king over the Assyrians in Nineveh. That obvious historical miscue only further confirms the fictional nature of the tale and draws attention more clearly to the author's apparent purpose in writing it. That purpose seems to be the promotion of strict observance of the Jewish law, particularly the ceremonial and dietary laws. The story may well be a product of the Jewish Pharisees, who will be further described in following narrative. The additions to the Book of Esther are supplements to the canonical account of Esther. Those supplements are found scattered throughout the Greek translations of the Book of Esther. Because there are no direct references in Esther to God or the Jewish religion, it may well be that the translators decided to add the various supplements in order to bolster the book's religious impact. Among the additions are a dream by Mordecai about the events recorded in Esther, the purported contents of King Artaxerxes' edict authorizing the massacre of the Jews, a supposed account of Esther's prayer to God before approaching the king unsummoned, the purported contents of the letter which permitted the Jews to defend themselves, and finally an epilogue in which Mordecai demonstrates how his dream had been fulfilled in all the prior events. The Wisdom of Solomon is a poem similar in style to Ecclesiastes and is characteristic of the literature in the wisdom movement of Solomon. Therefore, although it is written apparently as late as 50 to 40 BC, it sometimes bears Solomon's name. The poem speaks beautifully of God's omniscience, the nature of death, the security of the upright, the superiority of virtue, and the destruction of the wicked. As all wisdom literature, it eloquently exalts the value of wisdom. And reminiscent of the prophets, the writer launches a vicious assault against idolatry and pagan perversion. The writing concludes with a review of God's dealings with Israel and his perpetual care for his people, even in the times of their unfaithfulness. Ecclesiasticus is the longest book of the Apocrypha and is most similar in content and style to the book of the Proverbs. It was originally written in Hebrew about 180 BC in the city of Jerusalem, and then translated into Greek some 50 years later in the city of Alexandria. The last section of the book contains a review of all the great men in Jewish history, ending with Simon the high priest, who dies in 199 BC. A prologue indicates that the author is a man by the name of Jeshua, and that he has derived his thoughts from many years of studying the law, the prophets, and other Old Testament wisdom literature. It is not surprising that Ecclesiasticus, also known as the Wisdom of Sirach, after Jeshua's father, should begin with the words, "All wisdom comes from the Lord and remains with him forever." Like the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiasticus finds wisdom in the fear of the Lord and also in self-control, particularly of the tongue. Charity and humility are encouraged, and there are warnings against improper desires and excessive use of wine. The brevity of life and punishment of the wicked are seen as motivations for proper living. Wicked women and woeful wives are bitterly denounced, as are adulterous husbands. Unlike any of the wisdom literature found in the canonical scriptures, Ecclesiasticus includes such mundane advice as proper dining etiquette and basic health habits. There is praise for various occupations, from physicians to ordinary tradesmen, of whom it is said, "They support the fabric of the world, and their prayer is in the practice of their trade." In all, Ecclesiasticus covers a broad scope of wise sayings, reflective of the wisdom literature already presented. The book of Baruch, supposed to have been written by Jeremiah's scribe, purportedly accompanied a donation of money to support the worship in the temple in 582 BC. However, the fact that the temple was in ruins at that time casts doubt upon the historical accuracy of the writing. It appears that the writing actually emerges near the end of the 1st century, at a time when Jerusalem and the reconstructed temple are once again threatened. In the writing is a confession of national sin, a plea for mercy, a call for wisdom, and words of encouragement to a nation under oppression. These are followed by the letter of Jeremiah, purportedly from the great weeping prophet to the captives in Babylon, warning them against involvement in idolatry. The supposed letter is one of the most insightful and scathing attacks against idolatry ever written. The story of Susanna is a short story about a virtuous woman named Susanna, who is falsely accused of infidelity by two evil Jewish elders when she spurns their lustful advances. As she is being led away for execution, following a trial in which her accusers have perjured themselves, Daniel, presumably the Daniel of the Old Testament, urges that the two elders be questioned outside each other's presence. That move results in conflicting testimony which confirms Susanna's innocence. This story may well be simply a hypothetical case used to bring about reform of a rule of evidence in capital cases. While under the law it takes two witnesses to establish guilt, it remains possible for the two to conspire to bring about the death of an innocent person. Excuse me. The new rule of procedure would help to expose any such conspiracy and provide the death penalty for the conspirators instead. The Song of the Three Children is a writing of the period 170 to 150 BC, which is meant for integration with the book of Daniel at 323. It purports to record the miracle which saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they were in the fiery furnace, along with a prayer of Azariah, Abednego, which is really a confession of Israel's sin and a plea for the nation's salvation. There is also a song of praise to the God who has delivered the three men from the fires of death. The story of Bel and the dragon is a third story attached to the book of Daniel and is an attack against idolatry, especially the worship of serpents or dragons, as is prevalent in 100 BC when the story is written. The story sets Daniel in a controversy with King Cyrus as to whether the Babylonian god Bel actually eats the food offered to it daily. Through simple ingenuity, Daniel is able to demonstrate that the food is consumed by the priests of Bel. Daniel then causes the death of a revered serpent, which so angers its Babylonian worshippers that they throw Daniel into a lion's den. In this fictional version of the lion's den, Daniel is ministered to by the prophet Habakkuk, who is supposedly whisked in some miraculous fashion from Judea to Babylon for the occasion. The prayer of Manasseh is a brief but excellent example of a pious, penitent prayer, perhaps Pharisaic in origin. The first book of Maccabees contains the history of the Jewish people in Judea in the period from 175 to 132 BC. It details much of the history which will appear in summary form in later narrative. The principal kings of the period, the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt, are seen as a seesaw struggle, with the Jews caught in the middle. Reference is made to a later Roman power, but during this period, there is no direct Roman rule affecting Judea. The historical account begins primarily with the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes, who brings great persecution against the Jews and their religion. Militant reaction comes from those Jews who would rather die than see the law suppressed. Those Jews are led in battle after several decades by a man named Mattathias and 3 of his sons. The first son to take over his father's leadership is named Judas, but is called Maccabeus. It is this man after whom the historical record is named. Judas Maccabeus is followed by his 2 brothers, Jonathan and Simon, and later by Simon's son, John Hyrcanus. The military exploits of the Jews against Syrians, Greeks, Egyptians, and Edomites, as well as a number of more local enemies, are reminiscent of the wars of King David. But the almost constant fighting finally brings Judea and the Jews a brief period of peace in the midst of centuries of conflict. Jonathan and Simon are appointed as both high priests and governors, which indicates an evolution in the traditional roles of Jewish leadership. The first book of Maccabees is the most important and trustworthy history of the Jews during its time. The second book of Maccabees presumes to cover the period from 175 to 160 BC, but is less historical than patriotic. The book professes to be a readable summary of a much detailed 5-volume work by Jason of Cyrene. Most notable in the book are the graphic accounts of violent atrocities which Antiochus Epiphanes allegedly brought against the Jews. And a short commentary from these writings and the historical records of other nations over the next 4 centuries, something of the Jews' continued development as both a nation and a dispersed people can be pieced together. All right, that's it for today. All right, see you tomorrow. Have a great day.